They'll be crawling back before the first snow, begging for a corner to sleep in, Mr. Finch declared, his voice a dry rustle of authority behind the counter of his mercantile. He polished a tin canister with a rag, his gaze fixed on the two figures receding down the dusty main street of Providence. That cave is a tomb, not a home. Mark my words. Several patrons, huddled over coffee and checkerboards, nodded in grim agreement. It was a sentiment that had hardened into fact over the past few months. If you are to understand the nature of wisdom, you must first understand the shape of the vessel it is poured into. In the autumn of 1887, that vessel took the form of two 18-year-old sisters, Anya and Iskra, their faces set with a quiet determination that the town mistook for foolish pride. They were orphans, ejected from the county system on the day they came of age, with little more than a threadbare blanket apiece and a shared memory of a world that had always been cold. They did not speak of their past, for their past was a litany of locked doors and grudging charity. Instead, they walked, their purpose a silent pact between them. They walked away from the town that saw them as burdens and into the whispering aspen groves that fringed the mountainside. The people of Providence, a town built on the flimsy promises of gold and the stubbornness of its settlers, saw the world in terms of what could be quickly built and immediately sold. Their homes were pine boxes, thrown up in a season, their foundations shallow, their faith placed in the quantity of nails, not the quality of the design. When Anya and Iskra chose the cave, a dark mouth in a granite cliff face, the town saw it as the final act of a tragedy. They saw two girls, unguided and unloved, embracing the very earth that would surely claim them. What they could not see was the knowledge that lived behind the sisters' identical grey eyes, a different kind of knowledge, one not found in ledgers or deeds, but in the observation of seasons, the patience of stone, and the deep, resilient architecture of the natural world. They were not just seeking shelter, they were remembering a language the rest of the world had forgotten how to speak. The cave was not a welcoming place. It was a wound in the rock, smelling of damp earth and the deep, mineral cold of geologic time. A steady trickle of water wept down one wall, feeding a carpet of slick, green moss. The entrance was wide, a gaping maw that invited the wind, which swirled inside with a low, mournful sound. For a full day, the sisters did nothing but sit in the entrance, watching the light move across the stone floor, feeling the currents of air on their skin. They were not daunted, they were listening. Iskra, the more pragmatic of the two, traced patterns in the dust, mapping the way the air flowed. Anya, whose gaze always seemed to be fixed on something just beyond the horizon, felt the deep hum of the mountain around them. This was not a tomb. It was a lung. It breathed. Their first task was to understand its rhythm. They discovered a narrow fissure high up in the vaulted ceiling, a natural flue that drew the air upwards. This, they knew, would be the heart of their home. The floor, though damp near the entrance, sloped gently upwards into a second, drier chamber, a space shielded from the elements. Here, the rock was rough but dry, and the air was still and quiet. It was in this back chamber that they spent their first night, wrapped in their thin blankets, their backs pressed against the unyielding stone. The cold was a physical presence, a weight upon them, but it was a clean cold, an honest cold, not the damp, drafty chill of the orphanage dormitory. In the darkness, they did not speak, but their resolve solidified. They had been given nothing, so they would build from what was freely offered, stone, clay, fallen timber, and their own 2 pairs of hands. The next morning, they began their work, a slow and deliberate process that baffled the few hunters who glimpsed them from a distance. They did not hack at the world, but rather gathered from it. They were not imposing their will upon the landscape, they were entering into a partnership with it. Their movements were a study in efficiency, a silent dance of shared purpose. One would gather, the other would sort. One would carry, the other would place. The town of Providence slept in its wooden boxes, convinced of its own permanence, while just a mile away, 2 girls were learning to live inside the bones of the earth itself, preparing for a winter that would test the very definition of home. The hearth was to be the soul of their shelter, and they built it with the reverence of priests constructing an altar. They knew that fire was both life and death. A well-made hearth would give them warmth and sustenance, while a poorly made one could fill their sanctuary with blinding smoke or, worse, crack the very stones around them. For days, they searched the scree slopes and creek beds, not for just any rock, but for the right ones. They bypassed the smooth, water-tumbled stones of the creek, knowing that trapped moisture within them could cause them to explode when heated. Instead, they sought out weathered, angular pieces of granite and schist, stones that had already endured ages of pressure and change. They tested each one, tapping it to listen for the solid, resonant ring that spoke of integrity, discarding any that returned a dull, hollow thud. They carried the chosen stones back to the cave, their arms aching, their muscles burning with the strain. They were building not just a fireplace, but a future. Using pieces of a fallen pine, they scraped and dug at the base of the natural flue, creating a wide, shallow pit. Around this, they began to lay the foundation of the hearth, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle. Their mortar was the earth itself, a thick, heavy clay they dug from a nearby bank, mixed with water and handfuls of dry, shredded grass for binding. They worked the mixture with their bare hands, feeling its texture, adding water drop by drop until it was a thick, pliable paste. They laid the stones one by one, filling every gap, ensuring the structure was solid and airtight. They built the firebox tall and deep, with walls that angled inwards to reflect the heat out into the cave. Above it, they meticulously constructed the chimney, narrowing the passage just so, creating a smoke shelf, a small, flat ledge inside the flue. It was an ancient design, one that would prevent downdrafts and ensure the smoke was drawn cleanly out of the cave, even in high winds. The work was painstaking. Each stone had to be perfectly placed, each layer of clay mortar smoothed and sealed. Their hands became raw, their nails broken, but their focus never wavered. It was a monument to patience, a testament to wisdom that valued process over speed. With the hearth complete, they turned their attention to making the cave a livable space. The gaping entrance was their greatest vulnerability, a constant invitation to the wind and the cold. They began by constructing a low wall of stacked stone just inside the mouth of the cave, about 10 feet in. It was not a full wall, but a baffle, creating a small antechamber that would disrupt the direct flow of air, a simple yet profoundly effective windbreak. This small, 3-foot-high barrier changed the entire character of the entrance, transforming it from a raw opening into a purposeful threshold. The relentless drafts that had once swirled through the main chamber were now tamed, forced to navigate the new obstruction, their energy dissipated. Inside this protected space, the air grew stiller, quieter. Their next task was to insulate themselves from the perpetual chill of the stone floor. For weeks, they journeyed to the marshy lands down in the valley, where they harvested armfuls of cattails and tall reeds. They laid these out to dry on sun-warmed rocks, turning them daily until they were crisp and golden. Then, sitting in the filtered light of their new home, they began to weave. Their fingers, already calloused from hauling stone, learned a new rhythm. They wove thick, dense mats, their pattern simple and strong. They layered these mats across the floor of the inner chamber, creating a soft, dry surface that muffled their footsteps and held a surprising amount of warmth. The damp, mineral smell of the cave was gradually replaced by the clean, sweet scent of dried grasses. For their beds, they built 2 low platforms against the far wall, raising them a foot off the floor using stout branches and scavenged planks from a long-abandoned trapper's lean-to. Upon these platforms, they piled a thick mattress of fragrant pine boughs, which would not only provide cushioning but also help to repel insects. Over this, they laid their woven mats and the few blankets they owned. Beatrice, the town's foremost purveyor of gossip, made a special trip out to the woods under the pretense of gathering herbs, her curiosity having finally overwhelmed her. She peered into the cave's entrance, saw the low stone wall and the woven floors, and returned to town with a story that dripped with condescending pity. "They're living like animals," she announced at the mercantile. "Building nests of sticks and mud. It's a sad, sad thing to see." The long, golden days of late autumn were a gift, and the sisters used every moment. They moved with a relentless, quiet energy, for they knew that each setting sun brought the inevitable winter one day closer. Their focus now was on provisioning. Every day, Anya would take a large woven basket and venture into the woods and meadows, her eye scanning the landscape for nature's offerings. She gathered the last of the wild berries, spreading them on flat, dark stones to dry in the sun until they were sweet, shriveled jewels of concentrated flavor. She collected buckets of acorns, which she then painstakingly leached of their bitter tannins by soaking them in the cold, running water of the creek. Iskra, meanwhile, focused on the creek itself. She fashioned a simple but effective fish trap from woven willow branches and set it in a narrow channel. Each morning, she would pull it from the water, often finding several good-sized trout. She cleaned them with practiced efficiency and smoked them over a low, slow fire of alderwood, hanging the preserved fillets in the cool, dry air of the cave's deepest recess. But their most critical task was the gathering of firewood. They knew that a small, well-managed fire was more efficient than a large, roaring blaze, but the winter in these mountains was long and unforgiving. They would need a formidable supply. They did not fell healthy trees, instead, they became masters of scavenging. They sought out the deadfall, trees felled by wind or age, their wood already seasoned and dry. They worked together, using a small hand axe and a two-person saw they had traded for with a traveling tinker. They were a picture of perfect coordination, their movements economical and synchronized, their breathing falling into a shared rhythm as they sawed through thick logs. They hauled the wood back to the cave piece by piece, a seemingly endless procession. They did not simply dump it in a pile. Inside the cave, against a long, dry wall of the main chamber, they began to stack the fuel. It was a work of art, a monument to foresight. Each piece was fitted, the larger logs forming a stable base, the smaller pieces filling the gaps. The stack grew higher and deeper, a solid wall of wood that represented months of security and warmth. Olin, a grizzled trapper whose joints ached with the memory of past winters, saw their growing woodpile on his way back to town. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. Fools, he grumbled to his companion. Wasting the good months playing with sticks. A real winter will snap those girls in 2-inch. The world began to hold its breath. The vibrant gold of the aspens faded to a brittle brown and the leaves fell, carpeting the forest floor in a rustling shroud. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The migratory birds, once a constant chatter in the canopy, had vanished, leaving behind a profound silence. The squirrels, frantic for weeks, were now scarce, their caches full. These were the signs, the ancient warnings that the people of Providence, in their haste and confidence, chose to ignore. They saw the clear, cold skies as a blessing, a continuation of a mild autumn. They looked at their own modest woodpiles, stacked haphazardly against the outside walls of their cabins, and deemed them sufficient. They were a people who believed in tomorrow's labor, not today's. Lena, a woman of mixed heritage who lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, did not share their optimism. She had learned the land's language from her mother, and she understood the meaning of the deep quiet, the behavior of the deer moving to lower pastures sooner than usual, the unusual thickness of the beavers' dams in the creek. One afternoon, she walked the path to the sisters' cave. She did not bring pity or charity, but a bundle of smoked deer meat and 2 thick, well-oiled leather hides. She found Anya and Iskra reinforcing the seals of their hearth with fresh clay. Lena simply nodded, her eyes taking in the great wall of firewood, the neatly stored provisions, the dry, orderly living space. "The mountain is breathing deep," she said, her voice low. "It will exhale a great cold soon." Iskra looked at the hides. "We have little to trade. Your knowledge is its own currency," Lena replied, gesturing to a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. "You know the root that eases the lung fever. That is a fair trade." The transaction was made with few words, a silent acknowledgement of mutual respect between those who lived by the earth's rules, not man's. Lena's visit was a quiet validation, a confirmation that their instincts were true. While the town of Providence continued its business, its people confident in their plank walls and their proximity to Mr. Finch's well-stocked store, the sisters performed their final preparations, their movements calm and certain. They were ready. They had listened to the warnings, and they had built their home not in defiance of the mountain, but in harmony with it. The first flakes were gentle, almost apologetic, drifting down from a sky the color of slate. The townsfolk welcomed them with a novelty that bordered on celebration. It was the first snow of the season, a picturesque dusting that softened the hard edges of the town. But the gentleness was a lie. By nightfall, the wind began to howl, a low, predatory moan that grew in intensity with each passing hour. The snow was no longer drifting, it was being driven, a horizontal blizzard of fine, stinging ice particles that found every crack and crevice in the town's hastily built structures. The world beyond their windows dissolved into a maelstrom of white. In Providence, arrogance quickly curdled into concern. The neat woodpiles stacked against houses vanished overnight, buried under massive drifts. The wind tore at shingles and rattled window frames. A deep, penetrating cold, the kind that feels like it's coming from inside the walls themselves, began its slow invasion. Mr. Finch, secure in his mercantile, which was better built than most, felt a pang of unease as the frost crept across the inside of his large display panes, obscuring his view of the street. He had sold a record number of shovels and blankets that week, yet he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The town's confidence was a thin veneer, and it was cracking. Inside the cave, there was only peace. The storm that raged outside was a distant, muffled roar, the fury of the world held at bay by tons of solid granite. The low stone baffle wall at the entrance did its work, breaking the wind's force, allowing only a few errant snowflakes to skitter across the antechamber floor before melting. A small, steady fire glowed in the hearth, its flames casting a warm, flickering light across the inner chamber. The carefully constructed chimney drew the smoke up and away flawlessly. The air was warm, clean, and filled with the scent of wood smoke and roasting trout. Anya and Iskra moved with the unhurried calm of those who are prepared. They ate their meal, mended a tear in a blanket, and banked the fire for the night. They were not merely surviving the storm, they were living within it, protected and serene. The mountain, which the town saw as a terrifying, hostile force, was their shield. The tomb had become a womb. 2 days became 3. The blizzard did not relent. It paused only to gather its strength before unleashing fresh torrents of wind and snow. The town of Providence was now a prisoner. Drifts piled up against doors, reaching the eaves of the roofs. Travel between houses became a treacherous, life-threatening endeavor. The initial concern had given way to a quiet, gnawing fear. The first resource to dwindle was firewood. Families began to burn furniture, chairs, chests, anything that would feed the fire and keep the lethal cold at bay. The sound of axes splitting apart family heirlooms became a common, desperate percussion in the muffled silence of the storm. The collective dogma of the town began to fracture under the immense pressure of the cold. Olin the trapper, his own woodpile long gone, sat huddled with his wife, their faces gaunt in the weak light of a dwindling fire. His bravado had frozen and shattered. He thought of the 2 girls and their ridiculously large stack of wood, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced his stubborn pride. Beatrice, the gossip, was terrified. Her small cabin was losing its battle with the elements, the wind shrieking through the walls as if they weren't there. Her stories and judgments offered no warmth now. It was Samuel, the blacksmith, a man respected for his quiet strength and common sense, who first gave voice to the unthinkable. His family was shivering under a mountain of blankets, his children's faces pale. He had been rationing his own wood, but he knew it would not last another day. Staring into the weak flames, he remembered the sight of the sisters, day after day, hauling wood. He remembered the thin, steady plume of smoke he had seen rising from the direction of their cave right before the storm hit. They were preparing, he said aloud, his voice rough. His wife looked at him, confused. Those girls. The orphans, he clarified, a look of dawning realization on his face. We all laughed. We said they were playing in the dirt. But they weren't playing. They were working. They were preparing. The words hung in the frigid air, heavy with the weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. Their laughter had been the hollow sound of ignorance. The sisters' wisdom, once dismissed as foolishness, was now the only thing that made any sense. The breaking point came on the 4th day. A sharp, cracking sound, like a gunshot, echoed through the blizzard. The roof of the Miller family's small cabin, unable to bear the immense weight of the accumulated snow, had given way. A section of it collapsed inward, exposing the family's single room to the full fury of the storm. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the community. They were no longer just cold and hungry, they were in immediate danger. Samuel knew there was no time for debate. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and plunged into the white chaos. He fought his way to Olin's door, then to Mr. Finch's. A small, desperate group assembled, their faces grim masks of frost and fear. "There's only one place," Samuel shouted over the wind. "One place that might have heat. That might be safe." No one needed to ask where. The image of the cave, once a symbol of folly, now loomed in their minds as the only possible sanctuary. The trek was an ordeal. The wind was a physical wall, the snow a thigh-deep trap. They half-carried the terrified Miller children, their own bodies screaming with the effort and the cold. When they finally stumbled into the relative shelter of the trees near the cliff face, they were on the verge of collapse. They saw it then, a soft, orange glow emanating from the cave's mouth, a beacon in the swirling grey. They smelled the impossible scent of wood smoke. Hope, fragile and desperate, surged through them. They reached the entrance, expecting to find the sisters huddled and miserable, barely clinging to life. Instead, what they found struck them silent. They stepped past the low stone wall into a space of impossible warmth and order. The air was dry, the floor was clean, and a well-tended fire crackled in a hearth of masterful construction. Anya and Iskra turned as they entered, their faces calm, showing no surprise, no fear, only a quiet watchfulness. There was no "I told you so" in their eyes, no hint of triumph. They simply looked at the half-frozen group, at the crying children, and Iskra gestured towards the fire. "Come," she said, her voice clear and steady. "There is room." It was a moment of profound and humbling surrender. The town's strongest men, its most influential figures, stood as supplicants before the two young women they had scorned. They shed their snow-caked coats and moved towards the fire, bringing the biting cold and the stench of their fear into this tranquil space. The tomb had become an ark, and the keepers were the very souls they had condemned. Soon, more came, until 14 people from 5 families were sheltered within the warm stone walls, their lives dependent on the foresight of 2 orphans. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. The wind died, and a brilliant, blinding sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue, illuminating a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of white. The people of Providence emerged from the cave, blinking in the bright light like newborns. Their town was a ruin. Roofs had collapsed, cabins were damaged, and the landscape was alien and hostile. But they were alive. All 14 who had sought shelter were alive, saved not by their own stubborn pride, but by the quiet, diligent wisdom they had so easily dismissed. The dynamic between the town and the sisters was irrevocably changed. The scorn was gone, replaced by a deep, humbled awe. They no longer saw 2 foolish girls, they saw 2 women of incredible strength and foresight. Mr. Finch, his mercantile half buried in a drift, offered them anything they wanted from his store, free of charge. Olin, the trapper, spent a week helping them chop more wood, never saying a word of thanks, but his action spoke louder than any apology. Beatrice brought them a freshly baked loaf of bread, her eyes downcast, and mumbled, "We were wrong about you." The cave was no longer referred to with pity or derision. It became known simply as the shelter, a place of legend. People came to it not just for help, but for knowledge. They asked Anya how she knew which roots to gather, and she would show them. They asked Iskra about the construction of the hearth, and she would explain the principles of airflow and heat reflection. The sisters, in their quiet way, began to teach the town the language of the land they had tried to conquer. They taught them how to build with the grain of nature, not against it. That spring, the town did not just rebuild. It rebuilt differently. Chimneys were reconstructed with smoke shelves. Houses were better chinked and insulated. People began to stack their firewood for the next winter in long, orderly rows, protected from the elements. The memory of the great blizzard was seared into their collective consciousness, a harsh but necessary lesson. These are not just stories of survival. They are testaments to a form of wisdom that our modern world often overlooks. If you believe that true strength lies in quiet preparation and a deep understanding of the world around you, consider what forgotten knowledge might lie dormant in your own life. The tale of Anya and Iskra is a reminder that the most resilient shelters are not always built of sword planks and iron nails, but of patience, observation, and the courage to trust a wisdom older than towns, older than pride. Their legacy was not written in any book of town records, but in the smoke that rose from safer hearths, in the well-stocked pantries, and in the newfound respect the people of Providence held for the mountain that was no longer their enemy, but their neighbor. The tomb had saved them, and in doing so, had given the entire community a new life.